Oh, I think you just press the photo, the button to shoot.
Which button is that? Alright, maybe we'll try this one more time.
My name's Zach.
And what are we doing right now?
We're trying to set up the podcast. Episode 1. It's not going well.
The rough draft. Oh, shit. I'm not saying burn victims aren't... Cut this. Yeah, this isn't part of the podcast.
Okay, welcome to our podcast.
Is this part of the podcast, dude? Like, we're coming up with ideas for the podcast right now.
This is the podcast. We've already come up with all the ideas.
No, like, is this gonna be part of the podcast?
Yes.
Okay, like...
Everything you say is part of the podcast.
Oh, okay, everything I say is part of the... Alright.
The podcast is what it is.
So, like, is this gonna be in the podcast?
Mm-hmm.
Like what we're talking about right now, is it gonna be in the podcast?
As far as I can tell.
I mean the conversation, not...
I don't
edit
the podcast.
Are we recording right now? Is this part of the podcast?
I'm not the camera guy.
Are we in a podcast right now?
We're stuck in a podcast. That's a really bad thing for a podcast, is guys who can't tell if they're in a podcast.
Have you seen Old Boy?
Yeah.
Okay, so like in Old... You know, like he's trapped.
Wait, which old boy? Josh Brolin?
The
Thanos
Korean
old
one.
boy?
I mean, they're all the same, right? I mean, the American version's probably better. I'm just gonna say that. But like, you know how he's trapped in that hotel room?
Yeah.
And then they feed him, like, food. So the food for us is sponsors. So they're like, this meal's brought to you by Squarespace.
Is the scene where he gets out of the hotel the scene where he fights all those guys in the really long hallway?
No, that's a different scene. No, like, because the scene, at least in the Korean movie, like...
Because I'm thinking, here's my idea for a podcast. It's a podcast, like, and then it transforms into a feature film.
Like old
Like, the podcast is the beginning of the movie.
What if we hear a knock on the door and it's 16 by 9? And
16 Wait, what about our podcast? What is going on? What happens in our first episode of our first podcast?
It's a podcast about what this podcast is about.
But you don't say that because... Like, that's like explaining the joke to the audience. You wouldn't say that
now
on the podcast.
This is too weird. This is too weird now.
You wouldn't explain that on the podcast. Unless that was the podcast.
So we've always been talking about, like, a movie about podcasts.
We have always been talking about a movie about podcasts. That's true. I figured we would shoot a podcast. Just to exercise those ideas.
It's like really shitty improv. It's like improv but shitty.
Yeah, but you wouldn't say that it's shitty improv in the podcast.
We're saying it right now.
I'm gonna cut this all out. What happens in the first episode of our podcast?
I don't know, man. I'm not the editor. I'm not even the camera guy. This guy is. Is this part of the podcast also?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, this right now.